Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulihil kareem, assalamu alaikum. Welcome to our next lesson in the beginner level for Tajweed, where we build the foundations of how to read the Quran. The past few lessons we've been going over principles and general concepts on the Arabic alphabet and things you need to know before going into them. And today we're going to actually dive into the Makhaarij, or where each letter comes from, some tips and tricks on how to pronounce them, and mistakes to look out for that people commonly make. This is a diagram that I put together that depicts the 17 makharij, or the 17 articulation points where letters can come from. It's based off the 17 agreed upon makharij, so use this as a reference, screenshot it, save it, but we will be dissecting this, going into depth, and we will also be referring back to this diagram a lot during our future videos. We will also be making it available on the website, so check that out. I used to teach the letters in a very traditional way where we'd open up the Nurani Qaida and go one by one, but I prefer this way now because I'm a strong believer that learning where the letter comes from can help you visualize and help pronounce the letter better. So just to give you an orientation, this is a sliced view of a person's face, so we can see the inside of their mouth. Starting with the nose that kind of sticks out, then you can see that these are the lips, these are rows of teeth, this is the tongue, and then we've got the throat. So on the side here, I've depicted all the names of the teeth. So this is a good quick guide to look at what those letters mean. We will follow the path of a breath of air, which starts from the chest to the throat, all the way from the back of the mouth to the front of the mouth, and then out through the lips. The first makharij, which is singular for makharij, is the emptiness of the mouth and throat. So the letters that come from here are waw sakin, ya sakin, and alif. If you don't know what sakin is, don't worry, we'll talk about that in a future video. Essentially, these letters represent the vowel sounds, the longer vowels, the a, e, u sounds. They're more considered stretches than they are letters, and we'll talk about them more when we talk about long vowels. Well, let's take a moment to talk about alif. Alif technically is not considered a letter. The reason being is because it can't carry its own vowels. So you won't find alif fatha or alif kasra equals this, or alif dhamma. If you ever see a vowel in the Quran on top of an alif, then that's actually what we would call hamza. And hamza is the next letter that comes from the next makhraj, which is the bottom of the throat. Hamza is unique in the way that all the other letters are consonants. So jim makes a j sound, sheen makes a sh sound, la makes a l sound, but hamza doesn't necessarily make its own sound. I like to think of it as not having its own sound and just using the sound of the vowel on top. Because it's so unique, I kind of think of it as its own character. Let's say Hamza, because it's a very common name, is a shy guy, and he says, don't listen to what I have to say, listen to whatever the other person is saying. So if there's a Hamza with a dhamma, then you will just say the dhamma sound, the u sound. So Hamza, dhamma, u. Same thing with kasra, Hamza, kasra, i, and then Hamza, fatha, a. So you can see, those are just the sounds of the vowels themselves, and Hamza itself isn't adding any sound to that. And also because he's shy, Hamza also appears in the Quran on top of other letters. So Hamza can be by itself, like here, or it can be on top of an alif, it can be on top of a waw, even in some instances on top of a ya. But whenever you see Hamza in the Quran on top of any letter, it doesn't matter. We disregard the letter that it's on, and we just treat it as a Hamza. One of the most common mistakes that I see with Hamza is not enunciating enough. So not making it clear or sharp enough. So Hamza, fatha, a. This is very common because we see it in a lot of words. A'udhu billah. The first thing we say before we read Quran, a'udhu. We don't say a'u. That's making the Hamza fatha, but it's light. Like we said, light letters we smile, a'udhu. Same thing with Allahu Akbar. The lam in the name of Allah is heavy here, so we say Allah, but the Hamza is not heavy. So we can't apply the heaviness of a certain letter onto the letter before it or after it. Every letter must be given its due right. So when we say the name Allah, right? We're not saying Allah. We're saying Allah. Starting off light, then the lam becomes heavy, so Allah, Allahu Akbar, and then Akbar. That's just an example. So make sure whenever you see the Hamza in the Quran, even when you say Alhamdulillah, that you're smiling and you're really enunciating it, because that's the way Hamza sounds. The next letter that also comes from the bottom of the throat is Ha. This is very much like the letter H in English. It's airy, it's light, you smile, Ha. So Ha Fatha, Ha Dhamma, Hu, Ha Kasra, He. And usually people don't have an issue with this one. On to the next Makhaarij, which is the middle of the throat. Now this is actually at the level of the epiglottis, or the flap of tissue that covers your airway when you're trying to swallow food so you don't choke. But the letters that come from here are Ain and Ha. Ain and Ha. They are not in the English language, and people who only speak either Urdu or English have a very hard time saying these letters. But I've seen all my students eventually get the letters correctly. It just comes with practice. But one mistake that people do make when pronouncing this is making these letters heavy. So it's not Ain Fatha A, it's Ain Fatha A. They're constricted, so they sound like they might be heavy, but they're not. It's a constricted sound, but whenever you pronounce them, especially with Fatha, you're going to smile. A, Rabbil Alameen, not Alameen. And Ha, Alhamdu, not Alham, Hamdu. For the Ain, you can try pressing here kind of in the middle of your throat, and you squeeze down on where the epiglottis would be, and you get that sound of to become more familiar of where it should come from. So when writing out how Ain would sound with harakat, with fatha, dhamma, kasra, it's written usually just with an apostrophe, and essentially just give a little more depth to the vowel sound. So instead of saying the fatha sound, which is a, we add the a sound. So Ain fatha a, and dhamma instead of u would be u, and kasra instead of I would be I. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. عين. So عين فتحة ع, عين كسرة عي, عين ضمة عو. For ha, I like to imagine you go outside on a very cold day and you're trying to warm your hands, and you go when you're warming up the air with that by straightening the epiglottis, that's where that sound comes from. So it's very similar to the that you do to warm up your hands. Ha, again smiling. Ha fatha is light. Ha kasra. Hi, ha dhamma, hu. The next two letters that come from the next makhraj, which is the top of the throat, are ghain and kha. Ghain and kha, also two letters that are not in the English language, also two letters that people struggle with, but unlike ain and ha, these are just ain and ha with dots, as you can see. These are actually heavy. So you can imagine the dot on top giving it extra weight. So if you can remember that ain and ha are light, ha, then the extra dot on top adds weight on these letters and makes them heavier. So if the letter's heavy, we frown when we say it. So we don't say gha, we say gha. And we don't say kha, we say kha. As you can see in the diagram, I've made these letters red, and all the other heavy letters, the 7 heavy letters, will be red. The light letters are blue, and red plus blue equals purple. So you'll notice that I made the alif purple in this diagram because sometimes it can be heavy, sometimes it can be light. The other 2 purple letters, lam and ra, also have that characteristic, but will be discussed in a future video. So even when these letters have kasra, they will be lighter. They're not technically light, but this is as light as the heavy letters go. It's called the lightest level of heavy. So with harakat, ghain fatha, gha, ghain kasra, ghi, and ghain dhamma ghu. With kha, kha fatha kha, kha kasra khi, and kha dhamma khu. One thing to know about these letters, and it kind of gives us a glance into the topic of sifat, or characteristics of letters, these letters have softness to them, meaning that when you pronounce them, the sound of the consonant is elongated. So you have to have that kind of rough kha, 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 or the gha, gha, gha. You have to have that texture. Otherwise it becomes ga or ka, ka. We're not saying ka, we're saying kha, kha. You have to spend some time on that sound itself, which we can contrast with the next letter, which is qaf, qaf, qaf. Qaf comes from the extreme back of the tongue when it rises and touches the soft palate. One of the mistakes that people commonly make when pronouncing qaf is making it sound too much like kha, kha. So let's say khaf, khaf, or khaf, kha. It's kind of mixing the two. If there's any sound of kha in it, then it's not being pronounced correctly. So qa, 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 qaf. I described the sound as kind of wet because it's coming from the soft palate and the tongue touching. Qa, qa, qa. But if there's any kha, kha sound, almost that dryness, then that's not qaf, because the sound of qaf doesn't drag. It's not elongated in that sense, where it's not qaf. That would be an elongation, or qaf being soft. But qaf has the quality of hardness or shidda, not rikhwa, which is softness. So with harakat, qaf fatha, qa, qaf kasra, qi, and qaf dhamma, qu. Again, it's heavy, you frown. The next articulation point, or makhaarij, is not the extreme back of the tongue, but the back of the tongue when it rises, and this time it's touching the hard palate, k, k, kaf. So it's touching the hard palate, it's a little more dry sounding, has more air when you pronounce it. It's kind of like the letter K, but you're going to smile when you say k, kaf, kaf. Make sure you're expelling that air when you say k, kaf. Now on top of this kaf is not a hamza. It looks like a hamza, but this is just a symbol of kaf. And I only bring that up because I said earlier that if you see hamza anywhere on any letter, then ignore the other letter and just treat it like a hamza, but this is not the case with kaf. From the next articulation point, which is the middle of the tongue, we have the letters sheen, jim, and ya. Starting with sheen. Sheen is very similar to the sh sound in English. People don't usually struggle with this. Sheen, fatha, sha, sheen, kasra, shi, sheen, dhamma, shu. Similarly, jim is a light letter. It sounds a lot like the letter J, but some people who are native Arabic speakers sometimes pronounce it as ja, ja. And I just want to clarify, it's not jim. It's not jim, fatha, ja. It's j, j, jim. Jim, fatha, ja, jim, kasra, ji, jim, dhamma, ju. The next letter is ya. Again, sounds like the letter Y in the English language. Ya, fatha, ya, ya, kasra, yi, ya, dhamma, yu. It's the only letter with two dots underneath, so if you ever see that, it's automatically ya. Moving on to the next makhaarij, where we get the letter dad. Dad is known to be one of the hardest letters to pronounce in the Arabic language. I think it's up there with ra for myself personally, but dad comes from the upturned back edge of the tongue. So when you turn your tongue on the side, the back edge of that tongue, either the left side, the right side, or both sides, when they rise up and touch the upper molars, that's where dad comes from. Dad. Dad is the heaviest of the heavy letters because the entire tongue rises when you're pronouncing it. It's very tricky to pronounce and try to visualize it, but this part of the tongue, the side, will go up and touch the molars, the back chewing teeth. You can do it from one side if that's more comfortable. The other side you can try as well. Or what I like to do is just touch both sides with the size of my tongue. But you have to make sure you're frowning to properly pronounce this letter. Common mistake is, especially those from an Urdu speaking background, in Urdu this letter is pronounced with a Z sound. And so Ramadan becomes Ramzan, غير المغضوب becomes غير المغضوب. So be aware, especially if you speak Urdu, that might be correct in Urdu, but in Arabic, when reading the Quran, we keep the Z sound out of the letter Dad. So Dad, Fatha, Da, Dad, Kasra, Di, Dad, Dhamma, Du, Da, Di, Du. Moving on to the right side of this diagram, so just focusing on the top of the tongue. When the top of the tongue touches the gums of each premolar to premolar up here, that's where lam is pronounced from. Lam. It's very similar to the L sound in English. You just have to make sure that the tongue is touching from the premolar to the premolar, which if you find your canine teeth, canine meaning dog, name that because there are sharp teeth that kind of look like fangs. The tooth before that is the premolar. So the tongue will go from the gum of that tooth all the way to the other side. Lam. Again, lam is one of those letters that is sometimes light, sometimes heavy. It's only heavy in the name of Allah under specific conditions, which again we'll look at later. But for now, lam, fatha, la, lam, kasra, li, lam, dhamma, lu. Now the tongue covers less teeth and is only touching the gums of the canine to the canine. That's where noon comes from. Noon. Very similar to the N sound in English. Noon fatha na, noon kasra ni, noon dhamma nu. Na, ni, nu. Typically, pronouncing this is not an issue for most people. Next, on to the letter Ra. So Ra comes from when the top of the tongue is touching the gums of the lateral incisor to the lateral incisor. So only for the first 4 teeth. It's not like R in the English language, which isn't touching any teeth, R. But for this, the top of the tongue will flip up and touch the gums of lateral incisor to lateral incisor, and you will pronounce the letter Ra. It is heavy with fatha and dhamma on it, and light with kasra on it. Ra. That's why I've spelled it like this, R-A-W. So it's like awe, like awesome, Ra. Again, this was one of the hardest letters for me to get down personally because I just wasn't placing my tongue in the correct position where it's supposed to go. So learning the Makhaarij for this was very important for me. Where I was starting was this ridge kind of on the top, on the hard palate, and that's why I was saying raw from raw, but it's actually at the gums here in the front. Raw. One of the mistakes that I hear a lot of people make, even professional reciters, is they roll the R sound, roll the Ra sound, and say Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Maybe not that exaggerated, but there should be no rolling on the Ra. So Ra Fatha would be Ra, Ra Kasra. Ri, making sure you smile because it's light. Ri, also very tough one for people to pronounce. And Ra Dhamma, Ru. Make sure you're making that circling with your lips. Ru, not ru. Ru will be incorrect, but ru. Next we look at the 9 letters that come from the tip of the top of the tongue. So the first 3 come from when the tip of the top of the tongue, which we'll just refer to the tip of the tongue, is touching the gums of the upper central incisors. So your buck teeth or your front 2 teeth, when the tip of the tongue touches the gums of these teeth, dal, ta, and ta, they come from here. So dal is kind of like the letter D, but D comes from more of the hard palate. We have to bring that makhaarij down a little bit to the gums themselves, and we get dal. In my opinion, it's a little softer than D, but it's dal. The next letter that comes from the same spot is ta. Ta. Whenever you're pronouncing ta, you have to make sure that there's a little bit of air being expelled from your mouth as well. Ta. This is the quality of hems, or when the breath flows when reciting a letter. Kind of like a T, but again, T is coming from the palate, while ta comes from the meeting of the gums and the teeth. Ta fatha ta, ta kasra ti, ta dhamma tu, ta ti tu. The next letter, ta, heavy, is like ta, but the heavy version of it. So it comes from the same exact spot, but instead of smiling, we frown, and the tongue rises. Ta. Another big difference between ta and ta is that ta has the air and ta does not. Ta has a characteristic of jahr, which means that the breath doesn't flow. This is a very common mistake that I see people make, is they will say ihdina siratal mustaqim. Siratal, so both those ta's do not have that air ta expulsion when pronouncing. Again, because it has the quality of jahr, there is no air when pronouncing ta. Ta fatha, ta kasra, ti, ta dhamma, tu, ta, ti, tu. Now moving the tongue a little further down from the gums of the central incisors down to the edge of the central incisors. So you will see the tongue kind of sticking out when pronouncing these letters. The three letters that come from here are dhal, dha, and tha. Notice my tongue is right there. Dhal, dha, and tha. First up with dhal, it's a light letter, but it's soft. So like I said, the sound of the letter will be dragged on or elongated. So you'll be saying dhal, dhal. Not that long, but just showing you for an example. Dhal. Work on that vibration sound that needs to be there when pronouncing dhal. So صراط الذين صراط الذين ذين ذال فتحة ذا ذال كسرة ذي ذال ضمة ذو. For practice sake, you can try sticking out your tongue like that, and that's where you'll get the sound too. Moving on to tha, that comes from the same spot. Now tha has 3 dots. The only other letter with 3 dots is sheen, but tha only has 1 scoop, while sheen has 2 scoops, and that will be very important when recognizing these letters in the Quran. So tha comes from the same spot. Again, tongue is sticking out at the edge of the central incisors, your 2 top front teeth, and you'll be saying tha. I write it with the S here because a lot of videos I've seen explaining tha pronounce it like da, like a TH in English, but I feel like the texture of tha, the softness, is lost when you just write it as a TH. So I would personally spell it like this, tha. Almost sounds like there's an S in there. The final letter here at this makhraj is dha. Heavy letter, you frown. It's similar to dhal, kind of the heavier version of dhal because they come from the same spot. But like ta and ta, dhal and dha only differ in their heaviness. So they come from the same spot, but you will frown when pronouncing dha and smile when you pronounce dhal. So dha fatha, dha kasra, dhi, and dha dhamma, dhu, dha, dhi, dhu. This letter, dha, the last letter we saw, dhal, and the next one we're going to see za. And if you speak Urdu, bod are very commonly mistaken letters in terms of pronunciation. So make sure to know which one comes from where and which one has which qualities. The next makhraj is the space between the top central incisors and the bottom central incisors, and the tongue there in between both of those teeth in that space. That's where you get Sin, Sad, and Zai. Starting with Zai, often referred to as Za. This is just like the Z sound in English, and not a lot of people struggle with it for that reason. But again, this is the letter that sounds like a Z. Dha doesn't sound like a Z. Dhal doesn't sound like a Z exactly. And Bod definitely has no Z component to it. This is the one that sounds purely like a Z. Za. So Za Fatha Za, Za Kasra Z, Za Dhamma Zu. The other letters that come from the space are Sin and Sad. They both have a whistling quality to them, and without them they can't be pronounced properly. So Sin is a lot like the letter S, so not a lot of people struggle with it unless you have an actual issue with the letter S. But Sin Fatha would be Sa, Sin Kasra Si, Sin Dhamma Su. In contrast, we have Sad. It's the heavier version of Sin, you can call it. Comes from the same spot, has the same whistle. It's just the difference is when you say it, you frown. So Sad Fatha Sa, Sad Kasra Si, and Sad Dhamma Su. Sa, Si, Su. I've heard a lot of native Urdu speakers call it swad. There's no wow or W sound in there, so that would be incorrect. Just be aware of that. Moving on to the lips. Fa is the letter that comes from the lips when the top central incisors touch the inside of the bottom lip. That's where fa comes from. Not the outside, like that, but the inside, fa. It's like the letter F. It's very airy. A common mistake people make is not including the air and saying ba, ba. But when in reality, it's fa. And you should almost be able to hear the air across the room. Again, having that quality of hems. Fa fatha fa, fa kasra fi, fa dhamma fu. The next letter that comes from the lips, and this is particularly when the wet parts of the lips meet, so the inner wet parts, this is where ba comes from. A lot like the letter B, but ba is simple. Ba fatha ba, ba kasra bi, ba dhamma bu. Mim, on the other hand, comes from the joining of the dry portions of the lips, the outer parts, mim. Mim fatha ma, mim kasra mi, mim dhamma mu. A lot like the English letter M, and usually not an issue for people. The last letter that comes from the lips, the incomplete joining of the lips to be exact, is the letter wow. So when the lips come close together but don't actually touch, that's where wow comes from. Very similar to the English letter W. Wow fatha wa, wow kasra wi, wow dhamma wu. The last makhaarij is khayshum, or the nasal cavity. No particular letter actually comes from this articulation point. It just gives off the quality of ghunna, or nasality, or the nasal sound, like This nasal sound, if you cover your nose, you actually can't make it, and it becomes blocked off. But meme and noon are the two letters that have this embedded in them. So you can't say meme or noon actually while your nose is covered. It'll be very difficult. No other letter should have this quality of ghunna in it by itself. Otherwise, we would say that has too much nasality, and that's something we'll talk about in the section on long vowels. So those are all the makhaarij. This is the point where I'd say do not move forward unless you're able to recognize these letters that I've given you very easily. So go back to the flashcards if need be, write them out like I've written here with the spelling that I've written, and just go through them until you've gotten it well. If you're still struggling with the pronunciation, we do offer one-on-one coaching on our website, so make sure to check that out. There is an option for a free consultation if you just want to be pointed in the right direction of where you might be struggling or your major weaknesses are. That's a very good option for a lot of people. Even if you're not struggling with the pronunciation, the science of Tajweed has always been an oral science, meaning that a teacher always listens to the student and tells them, yes, you're pronouncing it correctly. And they can say that because their teacher told them that, and their teacher told them that, and their teacher told them that, all the way back to the Prophet ﷺ, who we try to emulate. So I would highly suggest the one-on-one coaching for anyone who's serious about learning Tajweed. And with that being said, in the next lesson, we'll look at different variants on how letters can look. We'll also go a little deeper into the letters that sound very similar to each other and how to pronounce them differently. And then we'll do some practice with harakat. So inshallah, see you there. Salam.